talked a little bit about budgeting and how we have to budget in advance and how our organizations may require us to propose our innovations in ways that are already legitimate, that the ways that they know that you're using the money in a way that's already valued, in a way that's not going to waste it, in a way that we should trust and we understand. And so how do we do that? Well, one thing to say is to say, let's look at how other functions in organizations develop legitimacy for their resource allocations. So there are other parts of the organization, say in marketing or say in finance, where they get resource allocations. What kind of language do they use, and how might we use that language? Well, there's an interesting paper by Klaus Brockhoff. I thought it was interesting anyway, that was where he sort of took these values in other parts of other disciplines and sort of applied them to innovation. So let's say in finance we may value capital utilization. So we have a measure of how efficient are we with the capital that we have. So if I go to a capital market, that is if I sell stock, I get people's money, how do I use that? Do I use that efficiently? I call that the ROI, right? The return on the investment. When we put money in to a project, how much money do we get out? We may also look at sort of our external resource dependence, our debt equity ratio. So these kinds of ratios and ways of looking at things that finance people have. Well, what if we were to adopt some of those? What if in innovation value, we might say, well, in innovation, the ROI, the return on innovation, we might say it's the profit over the R&D investment. Of course, it's a limited measure, but it's no more limited than ROI, which is also a limited measure. We might talk about knowledge equity ratio. How much external knowledge do we buy versus how much internal knowledge we create? And look at those two budgets and sort of compare those two. Are we efficient at the ways that we use the external information or knowledge that we buy? Another of these might be manufacturing values. How do manufacturing people look at the problem of resource allocations? How do they justify more resources? Well, labor productivity, how many sales per employee or what's our production per employee? And you can look through annual reports and see numbers like this. They're very legitimate numbers. And in fact, it makes sense, right? That if I'm going to put people on a project, what kind of return am I getting for that? Throughput time, like how quick does it make us to make a product? Like what's the amount of time that it takes, and we're increasing that, or is that spreading out? So manufacturing is interested in this. How could we use those values in innovation? Well, you might consider innovation efficiency. How many patents per R&D hours that you spend. And again, these measures are very flawed. They are, they will have problems, but so do the other measures as well. And so, so just think about it. Patents per R&D hours, or think about how it is that you might change these in order ways that make sense to you. Time to completion, average time to start to finish of an R&D project. You say, oh wait, but every project's different. Yeah, every project's different. Every product is different. And so even manufacturing people have different products that they have to push through processes, and they take different times, and yet this number still makes sense, or still valuable inside. Then we have, you may think of marketing values, like what are the marketing values? Is market share, how much of this market do we have compared to our competitors? Price elasticity, if I change the price, how much change does that do in sales, right? I look at those kind of things. Well, what would be the equivalent in innovation terms? Our technology share, how many patents do we have versus our competitors' patents, and that's almost kind of like a market share, but around patents. We might think of development elasticity. If we say, how much change in R&D expenditure will cause this amount of change in sales, if we have a good understanding of that, then we can predict how much money should we be putting in, and for the money we put in, what kind of return should we be seeing for that. And so again, these kind of measures, these real simple measures of innovation values, right? And again, they're all flawed, might be ways of helping us legitimize what we're doing inside. And part of this is to say, if I can get my ideas listened to fairly, then they have a chance. And legitimization is one of those tools inside of an organization that will really give you more chances in that way. So, I want to wrap up the organizational constraints. We've talked about strategy, that is the intention that an organization has, what it's trying to do, which requires us to understand what's going on in the landscape, what are the capabilities that we have, and those kinds of things, and how is that we apply those to innovation. Do we have the strategy that is appropriate for us? Or is innovation a part of that strategy? And are we asking people to help us in that same direction? Do they know the strategy, in other words? We talked about structure, about these problems of exploring versus exploiting. When we say efficiency is about exploiting, about doing things in a routine manner, and if that's the only way we're allowed to talk about things, if that's the way the structure of the organization forces us to behave, we're not going to explore, we're not going to get to other places. We looked at coordination mechanisms, how people are coordinated inside of organizations and authority. We also talked a little bit about motivation, trusting people. Do people know that making mistakes is okay or is it in fact valued? And finally, we talked about resource constraints, and sort of resources being the capability to act in terms of people, in terms of money, in terms of time, in terms of the value chain, even the processes that we have. These are the important things to make sure that when we have these in order, when we understand them very well, that in fact we can use them to use our understanding of these things to overcome the innovation constraints that are inherent in them. Because remember, innovation is pretty much the opposite of organization. And so if we're going to do that thing called innovation, we need to overcome these kind of constraints on the way there.